Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Institute for Policy Research seminar. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm the Director of the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath and a Professor of Public Policy, and I'm your chair for today's discussion. All around the world, we've seen huge changes take place as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, major interventions by central banks to try and stabilize economies, prevent deepening of recession, prevent financial crises. We've seen governments around the world take unprecedented measures to try and protect households, workers and companies from the effects of the crisis that the pandemic has caused. And these have led to some very interesting and important debates for the future of our societies as we come out of the immediate crisis and start to think more about the future. What has this crisis exposed in our economies that we need to deal with? And in particular, has it generated the demand for a different kind of welfare state? And the focus of our discussion today is on universal basic income, the idea that everybody should receive a payment universally without conditions attached, as a matter of citizenship right, a basic income paid to everybody at a flat rate, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of means testing and so on. Many people arguing that as a consequence of this crisis, we've seen real holes in our welfare states. We've seen many people, particularly those in precarious work, people in self-employment and others, exposed to a sudden loss of income and exposed to welfare states which are hard to access, tied up in form filling, conditionality and so on, all of which, it's been argued, make the case for a basic income as a way of helping deal with the economic crisis, but also to help households meet their needs, and in the future perhaps prefiguring a new kind of welfare state in which everybody has a basic income upon which they can draw. So these are the issues we're going to discuss today in the seminar. We've got until 3 o'clock to do so, and we've got three presentations, three speakers for you today. The first is my colleague Ada Garcia Lazaro at the University of Bath. Ada works on macroeconomic questions. She works also in particular at the moment on a research project looking at the impact of technology and automation on wages and the labour share, or the share of the economy taken in wages that goes to workers. And she's looking at those questions in particular to see whether there are macroeconomic challenges posed by automation that might themselves lend themselves to an argument for a basic income of some kind to help uphold workers. She's going to talk about what's happened in the macroeconomy, some of the responses, and these debates about how central banks and governments have responded. Should we worry so much about government deficits? How do we pay for them? Can we think about things like helicopter money, just giving money to people to help them through the crisis, and so on? She'll be followed by Dr. Luke Martinelli. Luke is another research associate working on basic income at the University of Bath in our institute. Luke has done a lot of research on how basic income proposals affect different kinds of households, their distributive consequences, but he's also been looking at things like the political economy of basic income. What kinds of societies are interested in basic income? How do basic income proposals relate to existing welfare states and so on? And Luke is going to talk about some of the responses that we've seen around the world in the crisis that look like basic income type responses, where households have been given finances directly by governments that look and feel somewhat like basic income. So he's going to talk about those kinds of questions and why we've seen those sorts of responses and what they might mean for how we think about the welfare state in the future. And then finally, to respond to our discussion and our debate, we're very pleased to welcome Rachel Statham, who is a senior research fellow at IPPR Scotland. That's the leading think tank in the UK on the centre left, has offices in Scotland where they've been doing a lot of work on these questions of how the crisis has impacted on people's financial resilience, but also their household income and the welfare state to which they're entitled in Scotland. And so Rachel's going to be responding to some of what Ida and Luke have to say in the discussion. So those are our presenters. We'll have some time when we come to the end of the presentations for some discussion and debate. So if you've got questions, let us know, let us have them. And then what I'll do is I'll field those questions and put them to our different presenters, and we can have a discussion and a debate before 3 o'clock. So the first person I'm going to ask to speak, I'm going to hand over now to Ida Garcia Lazaro. And as Ida gets her presentation up underway. I'm going to come out of my presentation and hand over to her.
So thank you. I will address three main points. So some about the economic consequences of COVID, some ideas of the ways to finance this crisis, and a proposal. So we know that the best way to fight a coronavirus is by following the social distancing measures. And that implies shutting down a lot of the economic activities. So here, I want you to show you what happened during the global financial crisis in terms of the size of the recession, and what are the measures now. As you can observe, countries are having a more dramatic decline in the GDP growth. The Eurozone is going to be the most affected one, followed by the US and Japan. Some emerging markets are doing better. They still have positive GDP growth, but it's very different than what happened in the previous recession. If we don't focus in GDP but jobs, then I want you to present this plot. Here in this axis, we see the vulnerability of jobs. The more vulnerable jobs are here, the more stables are in this size. And in this axis, we have low-paid jobs at the bottom, high-paid jobs here, and each circle, and this vulnerability is related to the probability of being laid off, or furlough, or decreasing the number of hours. So in these circles, we have each of the sectors, and the bigger the circle, the higher the number of jobs that are under threat. So you can observe clearly those two sectors are the more vulnerable right now. If we add an additional variable, such as qualification, in dark blue, we observe the countries, the sectors that have more than 40% of the labor force with high-skilled workers, and in light blue, the ones with a very few percentage of high-skilled occupations. Clearly, COVID-19 is not going to affect equally everyone. This bias against low-skilled jobs, low-paid jobs, and very allocated in some sectors. That is a plot for the US, but it's very similar in other countries. Here I want you to show you the responses of firms. In the UK, the proportion of businesses that said they laid off workers, so they decreased the number of hours before the announcement of the job retention scheme. As you can observe, again, we have the low-skilled sectors, the more affected, and the least damaged are the high-skilled sectors. But what happened after the lockdown extended? We observe in this bars the number of firms that said they joined the retention scheme during the end of March and the beginning of April. And again, we observe the low-skilled sectors that are more responsive to the scheme, and the high-skilled sectors less responsive. However, as the lockdown extended, we observe the high-skilled are also affected. So you can see the jump of the number of firms joining to the program, which might give us a sign that we are going to have big losses even in the high-skilled sectors. I want to show you also some figures about the unemployment rate. We have data for the last quarter of 2019, February and March, but in the last month, we have just data for some few countries. So you can focus in US. In the last month, the unemployment rate jumps more than 10 points. Canada, 5 points. And we expect the trend is going to be quite similar for the rest of the countries once the data is out. Korea is a particular case because at the moment is one of the economies with the best health strategy in test tracing coronavirus, but it seems to pay off in terms of unemployment. If we disaggregate this information, we see that the more affected groups in terms of unemployment are the young workers. You see the jumps from February to March, and women. See, regardless of the country or region we check, the situation is very similar. So what are the responses that the government has given? Well, they are very diverse and depend on the fiscal capacity of the countries, the debt ratio that they had before the crisis, and they go from tax relief programs, job retention scheme, loans to firms, deferral in taxes, or the QA in at least 3 countries that are the big ones. However, that has come with an increase in the fiscal expenditure. You can observe here the increase of the deficit in the last year, the last months of the 2020 is almost 6 points of the global GDP. And obviously this additional fiscal deficit comes with an increase in debt that, by the way, is larger than in the global financial crisis. So this is the size of the response, and you can notice that this recession is going to be higher. So what does that mean for us? Well, we wonder whether this is the end of the austerity, this central role that the government is taking at the moment to cope with the health crisis, but also to help vulnerable people, and more importantly, do something for the recovery, particularly because we know now that we are not going to have a quick recovery, a V-shape, as was announced by some central banks at the very beginning. Particularly because we know that there are massive job losses. Many firms are dying, and we can notice this in UK, but also around the world. So we actually need to think out the box and have a look at other kind of policies that can help to revive the economy, to boost the aggregate demand. And in this case, we want to talk about probably options like sovereign money, helicopter money, UBI for people. So in terms of helicopter money, let me say this is a very old idea that was actually coined by a very mainstream economist, Milton Friedman, and the idea was basically to give money directly to people. But at the moment, there are 2 big branches of this debate. One is that one, giving money to people directly, and the other is that central bank gives money to the government, basically that finance the government to cope with the additional fiscal expenditures. And in that branch of the debate is Jordi Garlic. He claims direct and unrepayable funding from the central bank to the government. So that actually avoids that countries increase the deficit and the debt that we already seen is happening. So whether these 2 ideas, either is for people or for government, are a good option. Well, Frances Coppola wrote an entry in mid-March, and he basically argues that because the interest rate at the moment is very low, there is no harm that governments finance the additional expenditures by an increase in deficit and debt. And when the interest rate rises, well, the central bank can finance or refinance the government through the usual operations that are buying bonds. Well, this is his opinion on that. And about the helicopter money to people, he argues that that's not good during the lockdown, but better if in the recovery phase, if so. I would say the reasons that he grasped to say that are on question for me, because one of the arguments is that if we give money to people, they are going to go out, you then follow the lockdown, they book tickets, do activities outdoor, etc. I think this is a big assumption, because here we are assuming that people actually don't change preferences. And one of the lessons of COVID-19 is that actually COVID-19 is showing us that people are switching from the traditional shopping to online services, e-commerce, and they are also changing patterns in consumption. So people is very flexible. So I actually don't agree with that point. But I give more credit to the second part of his argument, that he says helicopter money is not going to prevent the recession. So I would say helicopter money is good or bad depending on the objective. During the lockdown, yes, it's not going to prevent the recession, but there is nothing in the world at the moment that is gonna have to avoid the big shutdown. So, but however, if we give that money to people with the idea that we are helping them to cope with the financial hardship, then I think it's helpful. And we've seen in the other plots that I show you, there are millions of people that at the moment are facing job losses. They don't have money, they are under threat. So if we think helicopter money in that way, I think there are some valid points. Then there is another idea about helicopter money with an expiry date. Basically, the point here is that if we set a deadline, so people consume and not save with that money, I think it has a good argument. However, let's take a helicopter money should be unconditional. I think this is one of the main principles, and that idea comes from a letter publicized in the Financial Times like 2 or 3 days ago. I will skip this part. I just want to show you very quickly the idea of this Economic Commission of Latin America about basic income. This is emerging basic income to address the COVID crisis in Latin America, and they set different horizons. So in the short run, they are setting 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months of help. And they say if we give an amount of money that is equal to the poverty line estimated by the World Bank, which is $143 US monthly, then to reach the full coverage, we would need 10 points of GDP in the regional GDP, and 5 for a program that lasts 6 months, and 5 points if the program is 3 months. But if we just focus in a group that is the more vulnerable, then the cost is only 3.5 points, and we reach 34% of the regional population for a program of 6 months, and only 1.7 GDP points if we do the program 3 months, that is the time of the pandemic in average. And they propose a basic income dispersed by electronic transfers of, when it's not possible, by mobile phone deposits. We know that this has a lot of concerns about barriers at the operational level, but it's a proposal that I want to put for the discussion. I think this is all I want to say.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Ada. Thank you for that presentation. We'll now try to shift across to Luke to load his slides up. But just to take from that, you know, in the current circumstances, we've got both a supply shock and a demand shock. That catastrophic loss of household income for many households, other households unable to spend their money, saving more because of the lockdowns, are unable to access services they would ordinarily be spending on. And as Ada says, you know, we've seen many firms going to the wall, many firms unable to get back up into business at the rate they want, a V-shaped recovery not happening. So we're here dealing with not simply an issue of demand and maintaining household income, vital as that is for many households, but also a question of how the economy recovers. And in particular, given the role that government spending and debt has played in sustaining our economies in this crisis period, then how do we think about the future? Can we move away from the ideas of austerity that characterized the response to the financial crisis and think about government deficit and debts in a different kind of way? So on that note, I'll hand over to Luke Martinelli, who's going to go more specifically into these points about basic income and what's happened around the world, picking up from where Ada finished her presentation. Luke, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the introduction, Nick, and thanks for your really helpful analysis, Ida, as well, which tees up a few of the things that I've got to say. Hopefully now you can see my slides. I'm going to cover some of the same ground, but hopefully with a bit of a different slant, as Nick said. And what I want to talk about is three things. Basically, the arguments in favour of universal basic income as a coronavirus response. Secondly, what has happened so far in relation to policy responses to the COVID crisis. And thirdly, just some reflections on so what does this actually mean for the comparative feasibility of something like basic income going forward and the future shape of welfare states. So the first slide is just the arguments in favour of universal basic income as a crisis response. Universal basic income has been growing and going up the policy sort of agenda for the last few years. But I think the crisis response has really brought home some of the arguments in favour of a basic income. And there have been a flurry of really approving sort of media pieces, including in mainstream publications such as the Financial Times, that have suggested that basic income would be an appropriate solution to this crisis. In the UK, there have been a letter calling for recovery universal basic income from over 100 MPs and peers. And a recent survey I saw showed that 84% of the British public support a basic income for the duration of a crisis. I think it's worth drilling down a little bit, exactly distinguishing the sort of kinds of arguments that you might have in favour of universal basic income. Because I think there are three distinct ones, at least three distinct ones. The first is that basic income would be the most appropriate emergency response in relation to replacing those lost household incomes that Ida talked about. And I think as part of that, there are two main arguments in favour of basic income specifically. One is that it will completely and comprehensively fix the holes in the safety net. At the moment, various categories of workers to varying degrees in different countries are not covered by existing employment protection or by the existing welfare arrangements, particularly contributory schemes. So precarious workers, self-employed workers and workers in the informal economy are not covered as a matter of course. They've been particularly exposed, and that a basic income would cover those gaps most comprehensively of all, in fact universally. And the second argument is that because it's absent any conditions, it's actually able to get to people much more quickly and effectively. You don't have to worry about the bureaucracy and the administration of means testing or of behavioural conditions. So means testing and behavioural conditions gone. That means the imperatives of speed and reach point in the direction of a temporary basic income. So I think that's the first set of arguments in favour of basic income. And the second actually is a sort of different phase in the time, and Ida alluded to this as well. And that's the idea that we need a basic income as part of a recovery response. So not only does it plug those holes in the safety net and replace lost incomes, but also coming through the immediate health crisis, we are going to need something like a massive demand stimulus in the economy to give a shot in the arm to the economy and prevent a prolonged recession. And this relates to this idea of a shifting macroeconomic consensus that it is actually appropriate and acceptable to get into considerable amounts of debt, that is the right thing to do in order to prevent the recession from being prolonged, and even points to sort of less orthodox financing mechanisms, not just government borrowing, but also things like helicopter money, as Ida mentioned. And I think the third set of arguments are simply in relation to the exposure of existing structural problems and the way that they've exposed weaknesses in our economy that basic income would be a solution to as well. So it's exposed problems of endemic poverty, huge levels of labour market precarity and inequality. And obviously basic income is an anti-poverty mechanism. It also is argued to sort of prevent or at least help with labour market inequality by strengthening the position of the weaker workers. It's also exposed lots of problems to do with care and gender imbalances in work and care. And again, basic income is seen as a solution to those. Looking further to the future and thinking about future crises, basic income as a sort of long-term solution would enable people to stay home when these crises emerge. And they'd also manage the labour market change in terms of occupational decline. If we are going to see long-term labour market change as a result of this crisis in relation to the ways of doing business and so on, that will enable people to cushion them on their transitions to other occupations and enable retraining, for example. So those are the arguments sort of why basic income. And just very briefly sort of comparing policy responses to the crisis so far. First of all, I mean, there has been a large amount of variation by country. And I think that the IMF and the OECD have both produced really useful policy trackers to actually keep track of the main developments across the countries. But there have also been a number of fairly common responses that are pretty ubiquitous across at least the advanced capitalist world anyway. And the first one is that countries have, across the board, expanded their welfare provisions. You know, this has exposed huge gaps, and countries have actually been pretty quick to sort of try and expand their provisions to fill those gaps. So in the realm of coverage, they've extended their existing provisions to new groups of eligible people. So, for example, in the UK with universal credit, the minimum income floor has been removed from the provisions around self-employment. So that's allowed a load of self-employed people who previously would have been rendered ineligible, essentially, to claim universal credit. In terms of increased ease of access, again, to take an example from universal credit, there have been the provisions for meetings and labour market conditions have been removed. And also in terms of generosity, and again, in the case of universal credit, the actual payment levels have been increased. So lots of countries all over the world have been doing that kind of thing. The second main pillar has been what's called short-term work schemes, and in the UK, the furlough scheme, which is when government subsidises firms to retain employees by paying them a proportion or all of their salary. Again, as I just sort of mentioned already, you know, there have been a huge system of firm supports and loans to prevent insolvencies. And this has all been underpinned by a huge increase in borrowing, government debt, reflecting a sort of changing consensus on that and a move away from austerity of recent years. But there have been a number of countries that have done something a bit more radical as well. And I say UBI type reforms because I don't think they conform to the strict definition of universal basic income. But in both Hong Kong and Japan, they have implemented something akin to helicopter payments, not technically helicopter payments because they're not actually funded through money creation, but they are nevertheless universal drops of cash, not regular though, so they don't conform to the definition in that sense. And then a larger group of countries, and this isn't an exhaustive list at all, have actually implemented or are in the process of implementing unconditional but still targeted cash transfers. So this has been done in Brazil, Pakistan, Spain and the USA. These aren't strictly universal policies. They are actually targeted at groups of at risk of poverty, but those groups are conceived of much more broadly than under conventional means testing. And they tend to use existing systems and structures to actually to make the payments through, particularly in the case of Brazil with the existing Bolsa Familia infrastructure. Okay, moving to the next slide. So what are the implications of this for the comparative feasibility of basic income and thinking about the feasibility of basic income going forward? Well, I think the first main message is that the political economy and institutional context does matter. The way that reforms and policy responses have varied have depended on, firstly, how flexible and prepared were welfare states in the first place. is there an existing infrastructure there for cash transfers? What kind of policies and systems are already in place? And secondly, it's dependent on how many and which groups are most exposed. So I think that the fact that where we've seen moves towards universal basic income most strongly, or the biggest calls for, the most demand, if you like, are countries where there are very large proportions of precarious and informal economy workers, like Spain and Brazil and the other ones mentioned there as well. And I think in the case of the US, there was probably a failure of the sort of furlough and short-term work schemes to actually prevent a huge rise in unemployment and poverty. So you've got the existing infrastructure for cash transfers, and the other thing that matters is, you know, the outlook for recovery, whether this is going to be short-term, what is the medium to long-term economic outlook, and whether or not these kind of policies might be necessary or even feasible. So some of the other issues around feasibility I think are worth mentioning is, you know, there have been these calls for universal basic income as soon as the crisis hit. You know, in the short term, a lot of countries have come to the conclusion it's better to use or expand existing channels because there is no existing infrastructure for a universal basic income to be paid. And I think that possibly points to an argument that something needs to be put in place in advance of future crises. Again, the other issues around feasibility, I think the most important are public acceptance. So even though we've got that headline figure of 80-odd% in support, a lot of that depends on the exact policy detail, really. There are policy trade-offs in relation to different facets of policy design, and also in relation to the alternatives. And basic income isn't a particularly good income smoothing policy, and the furlough scheme that was brought in by the UK arguably did that quite well. So whether or not we'd need additional policies alongside universal basic income might affect whether it's accepted that one is required. I've just put the devil is in the detail there. I think a lot of this actually depends on the specifics of the schemes that are being proposed. What is the time horizon? How do they fit into the idea of, is it a temporary income replacement? Is it a demand boost, or is it a long-term structural measure? I think that will affect the normative acceptability of basic income across countries. The level and the interaction with wider welfare provisions. Ida's slides showed how the change in the level will affect the affordability so drastically, and also, as I said, how it interacts with other welfare provisions. And I think a crucial issue that needs to be addressed as well is how this is supposed to be funded, whether it is through government debt, which will need to be repaid, and if so, how is that debt repayment burden spread across different facets of society and also intergenerationally. So all of those issues are quite crucial to the question of how feasible is a basic income in practice. Whether these trade-offs can be resolved finally, I think is a sort of open question, and it does vary, of course, considerably from country to country. I think an interesting question will be whether this change in public opinion is robust, or whether it is a temporary response, or whether basic income is being viewed more seriously as a long-term structural measure as well. So I think that's everything I had to say.
Great, thank you very much indeed for that, Luke. So some important questions then about what the crisis has revealed about different institutional configurations of welfare states, and whether they're more or less amenable to basic income type interventions. Questions about the political constituencies in support of basic income. Have this sort of big shock that's affected everybody, that sort of removed the argument that we are sort of responsible for our own social insurance or welfare provision, you know, that everybody's been exposed to a crisis in some sense may increase, as Luke says, sort of, you know, arguments for more universal unconditional payments. But at the same time, you know, will that last? Will that change in thinking last? And how do these issues relate to the question of government spending and debt? You know, do we have a different attitude now to government deficits and debt and how we finance something like basic income? Or will we see a reversion to more orthodox ways of thinking about government spending, where treasuries around the world seek to, through a combination of growth and tax rises and moderate inflation, perhaps, think about restoring public finances in those ways. So those are some questions, but I'm going to hand over now to Rachel. Rachel's going to give us some responses to what she heard, but also some thoughts for our discussion. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. And thank you so much for both those excellent presentations. I think raised some really useful provocations and some definitely some food for thought. So at IPPR, we've done some work looking at UBI as a kind of concept more broadly, particularly as an anti-poverty measure. And I'll expand on that in a little bit, but that's largely because of the context of our work in Scotland, speaking about kind of political appetite for a UBI. Many of you might be familiar that Nicola Sturgeon, as First Minister in Scotland, has recently spoken to UBI as an idea that time has come, in quite stark contrast to the Chancellor at Westminster, Rishi Sunak, who I think has described it as kind of off the table categorically. And so Scotland's in quite an interesting space at the moment, where there's quite a lot of political appetite for the notion of UBI. But as I'll hopefully get into with some more questions than answers, there's some interesting challenges there as to how feasible it will be within the kind of current fiscal framework that Scotland works within, and the devolution settlement more broadly. So I wanted to ask basically what the purpose of a UBI is, both in the kind of varieties of calls for UBI that have happened within the crisis, within the context of this crisis, and what purposes people might think towards the UBI as fulfilling, both in the recovery from this crisis and beyond. And I think this really matters to kind of pin down the UBI debate. It matters both for understanding how useful or effective any particular design might be. As Luke was saying, the devil is often in the detail in these conversations. But it's also a means of working out what purpose we're actually looking to fulfill, by making sure we're not kind of looking to fulfill multiple purposes at once, as is sometimes the case in these conversations. So I suppose if we're thinking first to UBI in response to COVID, which we've been discussing, as a form of demand stimulus, I guess I had kind of some immediate questions around what we know about the distributional impact of this crisis so far, which households are being most affected. Some kind of early evidence from the UK context, as the context I'm most familiar with, at least suggests that the asset-owning wealthy are relatively insulated, while low-income families, those in precarious work, as you've both been speaking to, and in those sectors, either that you pulled out, particularly, like retail, hospitality, tourism in Scotland, particularly, where there's lower pay more broadly and less secure work, being most exposed to the crisis. And then there's, I suppose, a parallel question to that, which is where demand stimulus flows. So kind of who pays and who wins, as IPR has put it, IPPR, sorry, acronym confusion, and which parallel fixes you might need to deal with some of those kind of structural challenges that I think, Luke, you've alluded to. So basically the question is, I suppose, can a UBI provide that progressive stimulus that supports a kind of economically just recovery, or sows the seeds of longer term structural change, and how might that be? And then I suppose, next to that is how a universal payment compares to more targeted approaches. So as we've seen, through the UK government's job retention scheme and the uplift in universal credit, the investment in our existing welfare state structures there. I was interested in your views, Ida, as well, and kind of what the trade-offs are across different economies, across economies with mature welfare states like the UK's, or others across Europe, and then also compared to to other economies, both in Europe and developing economies as well. We look at what's been offered in Spain as a kind of a targeted unconditional payment, whether that's in the context of a kind of lack of more established welfare state structures as compared to other European economies, or if it's aiming for something else entirely. And so I also kind of wanted to drill down a little bit into UBI as an anti-poverty mechanism, given the kind of depth of the household financial shock we're living through at the moment. I think there's key challenges that we've identified through our work there, both in terms of adequacy of payment, as you both alluded to, and also kind of in measurement, what the objective you're looking for is. And here you get into some quite complex debates about what poverty measure continues to be useful, if you're looking to kind of redesign your income distribution altogether, both through UBI and how you'd fund it. I know, obviously, Luke, you've done a lot of modelling looking at those questions in some more detail. So I'm going to rattle through some questions, and obviously you can kind of take notes and pick some you'd like to respond to. So in Scotland, our kind of some more basic modelling we did back in 2018 found that a basic income, a kind of a fairly low level payment, would only reduce relative child poverty by about 60,000 children. So it would leave about 23% still in relative poverty, and that's a challenge I think you've quite often you've had from other country contexts as well. About the anticipated costs. We talk in Scotland about a UBI roughly costing the same as the Scottish National Health Service, and what the poverty effect might be. And I would welcome your thoughts on the kind of the relative value of this sort of universalist intervention in the context of rising inequality, if not rising relative poverty, depending on what happens to median incomes and how useful that measurement is in a shock like this. And also your thoughts on kind of alternative universal payments or kind of universalist interventions. So we've had, we considered in the Scottish context, the minimum income guarantee as an alternative model. So aimed at delivering income adequacy, or at least a degree of economic security for households. And that included kind of additions for disability, housing, childcare, retaining some of those component parts of existing welfare structures that you spoke to, Luke. And I wondered how you thought that compared in this context. I know we've got some work coming out at IPPR thinking about a minimum income guarantee as a kind of potentially a more useful kind of intervention in this sort of a crisis, to make sure that income adequacy levels met. And I also wanted to speak to some quite exciting and extensive modelling that we've been definitely can't take credit for, but I've been part of through the Scottish Government's feasibility studies into basic income pilots. And so those have looked at both at the kind of immediate microeconomic or household level effects of a UBI, and then we've also looked to model the macro effects, and that's with the Fraser-Valander Institute and Manchester Metropolitan University, and those should be published in the summer. Sorry. And then we've also looked at kind of the second order household distributional effects as well. So in our kind of transformed economy, what household impacts do we actually see playing out? Apologies for my crackling voice. And then just some other kind of purposes for UBI that I thought would be useful to discuss is UBI as a mechanism for tackling inequality. So debates around kind of gender and paid work, which you touched on, Luke. What happens to bargaining power, particularly bargaining power of low-paid workers as compared to higher income workers. I'm particularly interested in your thoughts, Ida, on how that plays into the automation debate and what that kind of labour market disruption piece might look like, and what the case for UBI is in anticipation of kind of further kind of large-scale economic disruption down the line. And then also what it means in terms of simplifying welfare provision. So Luke, you mentioned kind of speed, and I think kind of came at it from two different angles. Sorry, both from a new system that would obviously have kind of startup costs in terms of the administrative burden and the pressures there, and the kind of the urgency of needing to get money into families' pockets now, essentially, as this crisis plays out. And then also thinking about the kind of complexity of partial versus full designs within a UBI structure, and what the kind of trade-offs might be there, both in terms of impact and affordability. And then I think finally, a kind of back in the kind of political context, whether the opportunity for basic income might have passed, and as I think both of you mentioned, whether this is a kind of a question for the kind of next crisis and how we might respond to it, rather than one that might be implemented within this current context. I'll be quiet now because my voice is about to break entirely, but hopefully we can get into that a bit more in the questions. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. I'll let you get a glass of water. Thanks for those excellent questions. There's a lot there, and we've also had some questions from people following the seminar, which it would be good to address. And so perhaps Adrian and Luke, I can come to you and ask you to pick up some of the things that Rachel said, but firstly, direct a couple of these questions towards you too. One, let's start with you, Ada, if we may. One is, will people be inclined just to save any money that they get now? That if they haven't lost their jobs, if they haven't been made unemployed and they're not in the government retention scheme or schemes like it, that they've got reasonable savings. In fact, they're not able to spend their money. So giving a universal payment to people is going to misdirect resources. I suppose that's one question. And related to that is, this wider question of, deficit financing. Although we've seen huge interventions from central banks and we've seen massive increases in government deficits across the world, are we actually going to move to a situation where people think differently about money and where it comes from, and whether debts do have to be repaid? The whole debates that we see in the kind of modern monetary theory space, but also sovereign money arguments and so on. So perhaps you could cover those two, Ada, and then I'll ask Luke to make some responses.
Yes, thank you, Nick. So I would say, first of all, that yes, this is a turning point. COVID crisis is an opportunity to actually change what we always thought was the mainstream idea. So we need to think for other possibilities. I know it's very hard to convince governments that they spend in more deficit, but the COVID crisis shows that it's simply needed. They didn't think much. They just increased the expenditure because it was a matter of life or death. So in that respect, I just say, I think, at least in my opinion, we are not going to go out of this crisis without a larger spend of money. That's not possible because we have at the moment supply and demand shock combined, and if we want to put another additional constraint is that soon we might face also a financial crisis because a lot of firms are not going to be able to repay the loans. So there are a lot of things that are mixed together, and the global financial crisis showed that one effective tool was the quantitative easing, at least in terms of rescue banks and firms. We can also discuss later about the implications in terms of inequality. But for one part of the market, the supply side, quantitative easing loans are needed and are needed more now, for the recovery phase. But for the other side of the market, the demand side, people, we also need to do something because we've seen the figures for unemployment rate. They are just dramatic. So we haven't seen these figures for a long time, and we clearly need different policy measures. And I think this is one to be the driver for countries to push for more deficit. So now the question is whether we want to finance it by debt or by creation of money. So the traditional way is debt. But it happens that at this point, many advanced economies have a huge level of public and private debt. So as soon as the interest rate rises, they are going to face a lot of burden. I'm not talking about this year, but in the future, right? So then that's why the idea of helicopter money from central bank to government is, in my opinion, a feasible idea. To finance the additional expenditures, but that's not exclusive of giving people money directly. So if I was just for me, I think we need to think in all the possible measures. That's about that. And the second thing is whether yeah, those were the points, right? I don't know if I've missed another question.
That's fine. Thank you, Ada. That's very helpful. That's very useful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. So Luke, I mean, if I could go to you, I mean, Rachel asked a lot of questions about whether UBI policies are good at alleviating poverty, what they do for questions of inequality, which we're also concerned about, and how you raise the fund, this question of money creation versus, say, wealth taxes for thinking about how you finance something like UBI. You've done a lot of work on those distributional questions, Luke. Do you want to say something about those?
Yeah. Yes, thank you for those questions and reflections. And yeah, I mean, I think this, you made a few really interesting points and some quite searching and fundamental questions really about what a UBI does, what its real purpose is for. I think one of the interesting things about that, I mean, you said, we need to sort of decide what it's for to decide whether it's the best tool, and I agree with that. I think that one of the interesting things about it, of course, is that you kind of undersell it if you look at it just as a poverty alleviation measure or in different contexts. The thing about a basic income is potentially, at least, it can do all of those things, which it strengthens the argument in favour for it. But for each of the individual sort of functions that it has, there is another alternative and potentially a lot less costly alternative. So that takes away from it. And the other thing to mention is that as I mentioned previously, and as you alluded to as well, the effectiveness of a basic income in each of these sort of realms, if you like, in poverty, inequality, administrative simplicity, bargaining power, gender, to name a few, they all depend on the detail, and it is impossible to get away from that really, because it can be an incredibly positive poverty alleviation tool. But it depends partly on things like the interaction with the existing welfare system. And if you strip back everything else, it's more difficult for it to be good at poverty alleviation. If you leave everything else in payment, then you sort of fall off on the goal of administrative simplicity. And there's a whole bunch of trade-offs that we sort of look at in some of the work we've done at the IPR. A more generous basic income would more effectively improve people's bargaining power at the bottom of the labour market, but it would also potentially have adverse implications for labour market participation, which might make it less sustainable, to name another sort of important trade-off. In relation to, in general, I think the case has been made quite effectively. It can be very positive in all of those areas. It is possible to design something. The fiscal cost will be considerable, and if you rely purely on the payroll tax system, then it might be politically unpalatable. But allowing for those other sort of less orthodox means, like wealth taxes and other things, in combination, I think does actually provide quite an impressive sort of progressive bundle. So yeah, I think hopefully that answered some of the points that you made.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Luke. Thanks very much. Rachel, can I just ask you? We've got a few minutes left. And ask some questions from around the world as well. Scotland is obviously a very interesting case because you've got high levels of political support from the dominant party in Scotland, the governing party, dominant party when it comes to Westminster. So can tell us something about how political support is generated for basic income and why it's built up in the way it has. By the same token, Scotland doesn't have its own currency, it doesn't have its own central bank, it's fiscally constrained, it's part of a United Kingdom which has a set of rules about fiscal policy, but also on the welfare state. And so some of the issues that we've been discussing about, particularly that Ada's raised in her presentations about government financing, just don't apply to what is although it's a national government in Scotland, is not the government of a nation state with all the tools at its disposal. And so I wonder what you might say about the sort of lessons from that circumstance for this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they probably speak, the Scottish context probably speaks a lot to the kind of list of questions and trade-offs that I kind of automatically have in my mind when discussing this. I think in terms of the kind of political context and why there might be kind of particularly broad-based support in Scotland for the notion of a UBI, I think does play into exactly what Luke was just speaking to, in that these trade-offs are inherent when you're looking at the kind of detailed design of a policy, and that because of the kind of fiscal constraints and the political constraints in Scotland, we haven't had to get to those trade-offs in a kind of conversation, in a public debate so far. So the kind of it can be all things to all people, I suppose, in its current form, without having to kind of commit to who, how it will be funded, what trade-offs would have to be, particularly at the kind of the top end of the income spectrum, or indeed, the kind of the circumstances of that being administratively feasible, which we would imagine would be, in the context of an independent Scotland at least, and then that's not taken into consideration the kind of the macroeconomic challenges you might have within that context. But I think there's kind of a inherent appeal that has something to do with the kind of solidaristic nature of UBI. I think that's quite that speaks quite a lot to kind of a lot of the SNP's positioning more broadly in government in Scotland, and I think that's kind of part of the package. But it'll be a really interesting debate to see how it plays on in terms of particular proposals and the detail. And as Luke was saying, looking to the wider set of progressive taxation measures that might be in the basket if we're looking at how we pay for it.
Great, thank you very much indeed. I just want to say to Luke and Ada, if there's anything else you want to come in, we've got a few minutes left. We've had some other questions. Please just, if you've got anything you're burning to say, chip it in now. Otherwise, I'll turn to start wrapping things up.
If I can say something about
yes,
the. Yeah, okay, thank you. So about the questions related to the GDP as a good measure of whether we need to look for other indicators, I think there is a lot of debate. I mean, we know that the traditional and the official measure of the economic activity is GDP, and it's good in the sense that it's comparable. We can get a sense how the economy is behaving, but clearly it's not showing how good people feel, whether they have well-being, whether they are happy, whether the output is distributed equally. So we don't say anything about that. And even the GDP per capita is not a good measure because it's very biased. So I think there is a lot of debate right now about new measures, more inclusive, that obviously it's in the early stages, and there are a lot of academics and even some presidents talking about the topic. But I mean, as soon as we get something more meaningful and comparable across country, I think we definitely are going to transit to that. So just to add. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Ada. Thank you, Luke. And thank you, Rachel, for joining us today from Scotland. And we really appreciate your perspectives on UBI. And we've had a number of questions which go from the sort of local perspective, the perspective of places like Scotland as nations, small nations, up to very global questions about what's happening to the global economy, but also basic income in South America, Asian countries, and so on. To those who've tabled questions, sorry if we haven't answered them all. There'll be plenty of opportunity to carry on debating these issues, and we will do so within the IPR and more broadly. And I think, I hope today that what we've been able to do is just to sort of lay some foundations down for some of that discussion. How do we relate these big questions of the global macroeconomy, how we recover from this crisis, to questions of then our future of our welfare states in different political and institutional settings, both within countries and between them. And one of the big tasks, I think, of public policy analysis in the months ahead is going to be comparative, is learning from each other, understanding what we can and can't transfer, and understanding the politics of different countries and how they relate to our own. So lots of food for thought in what we've been discussing today, and this debate will continue, I'm sure, in many different fora. Basic income was already raising up the political debate, as Luke said, before the crisis. The crisis has made it come even closer to the fore, and will doubtless continue to be discussed and debated as we recover from the coronavirus crisis as we've experienced it. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thank you for those that have participated in watching this event online, and those in particular who submitted questions. Do stay in touch with our work at IPR. We'll be doing more events over the summer, and we'd love to continue to engage with you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.